All right. In chapter 6, we're looking at juvenile delinquency. If you remember back in chapter 1, when we were kind of introduced to the concept of juvenile delinquency, I mentioned that we have a great course here at the University of West Georgia on juvenile delinquency. Great class for anybody that wants to work with juveniles in probation, in any aspect of victimology, family violence. Really anybody that's interested in working with juveniles, or if you just need a great elective, it's a really interesting course to take. So I definitely recommend taking that course. So when we talk about juvenile delinquency, we're talking about behavior against the criminal code by an individual who has not reached adulthood. And so that is defined as 18 here in the United States. But delinquency goes beyond that. And since there are behaviors that are not against the criminal code for people of legal age, which are prohibited by juveniles, and those are called status offenses. Remember, we talked about status offenses back in chapter 1. Examples of status offenses are things like alcohol use under the age of 21, truancy, running away, youthful offenders, and it varies by state. This is just a different label that's attached instead of juvenile delinquents, youthful offenders. So it varies by state. Some states give criminal courts jurisdiction over kids between the ages of 16 and 18. Youthful offenders, they would still go to the adult criminal court. So instead of being called juveniles, they're called youthful offenders. States also vary on how young a child can be when they are sent to the adult criminal court. Some states, it kind of depends on the offense. In most states, it's about 16 if you commit a violent act, so homicide, rape, robbery, all could potentially be, and it's called a waiver, waived to the adult criminal court system instead of being the case being heard in a juvenile court. In some states, there's been kids as young as 10 that have committed homicide that have been transferred to the adult criminal court system. It's definitely something that is an important decision that has to be made. Some states have automatic waivers. So if a 16-year-old commits first-degree murder in some states, it's nobody's decision. It's automatically waived to the criminal court. And in other states, the prosecutor has to decide, or in some cases, the judge has to decide. But it's a super important decision because once a juvenile is waived to the adult criminal court system, there's no going back. And remember, the juvenile court system theoretically is designed to be rehabilitative, where the adult criminal court system is designed to be punitive. Now, the social definition is a little bit different. We definitely have our legal definition. A juvenile delinquent is somebody under the age of 18 that has violated a criminal code or one of those status offenses. Social definition of juvenile delinquency, it varies. Everybody has kind of their different ideas about what a delinquent is. Not all delinquent behavior is criminal. Again, particularly with the status offenses. I did mention back in chapter 1 that it is a high category of that dark figure of crime because not all juvenile delinquency criminal behavior is reported to the police. Child delinquents 7 to 12. Over the past decade, the number of child delinquents handled by the juvenile court system has increased by 33%. Overall, children younger than 13 make up about 9% of all juvenile arrests. And again, the social definitions include a wide variety of behaviors that may or may not overlap with criminal behavior. So it could be inappropriate behavior, aggressive behavior, truancy, petty theft, drug use. Some of those are criminal, some of those are not, may or may not come into the attention of the police because they can be handled by social services, the juvenile court, diversion programs, and as I mentioned previously, that parents often get involved and try to handle it outside the parameters of the legal system. Now, when it comes to some of the potential psychological diagnoses for juvenile delinquents, I mentioned previously conduct disorder. We talked about that in chapter 2, and that is habitual misbehaving, including serious behaviors. Remember, the kind of key is the lack of empathy, sympathy, inability to feel guilt, remorse, and shame. Remember, you can't be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder until you're 18. So instead, we use the diagnosis of conduct disorder. But it also among those key elements includes repeated behaviors, serious behaviors like setting fires, violence towards animal, violence towards people, habitual lying. There's a handout under Chapter 2 that outlines the changes that were made for diagnosing conduct disorder with the new version of the DSM that was released a few years ago. Now, antisocial behaviors are usually reserved for more serious habitual violence towards people. It is not a diagnostic category. It would still be conduct disorder, but it's a type of behavior, usually involving behavioral pattern involving violence towards people. Don't confuse any of those with antisocial personality disorder, which is a clinical diagnosis reserved for adults over the age of 18. And remember, I said that unfortunately, there's a very strong correlation between being diagnosed with conduct disorder as a juvenile and being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder as an adult. Externalizing disorder is acting out and having chronic behavioral issues. And again, these kind of all overlap with each other. Now, when it comes to the nature and extent of juvenile offending, it's largely unknown because we do have that dark figure of crime. In 2013, just over 500,000 people under the age of 18 were arrested by law enforcement officers in the United States. That is a little bit of a decline from 2004, but again, we don't know the true number because of that dark figure of crime. Now, I do have under this chapter in D2L arrest rates, violent crime index rates for juveniles. So make sure you take a look at those. It talks about it illustrates the number of arrests made by states for juveniles and the crime trends for juveniles. Here's some statistics from 2013 and 2004 that shows those declines, and that's a good thing to see the percentage gone down. 45% change is actually a pretty significant change, but you can see that the numbers have gone down in most categories of crime for juveniles between those years, and it's pretty significant with a lot of these numbers. So categories of juvenile offending, unlawful, and these are the same as for adults, by the way. So these are just violations of the criminal codes, but unlawful acts against persons would be violent crimes similar to those committed by adults, such as aggravated assault, robbery, sexual assault, homicide, and then, of course, property crimes. So again, similar to those, same as those as committed by adults, burglary, larceny, theft, vandalism, stealing cars. All of those would be examples of crimes against property. And it's these crimes that are more likely to get a juvenile waived to the adult criminal system because these are violent crimes. These crimes typically are going to stay in the juvenile court system, but these have the potential, particularly with homicide and sexual assault, to be waived to the adult criminal court system. We also, of course, have drug offenses. These are big for juveniles, possession, distribution, or manufacturing of drugs. Generally speaking, juveniles are not arrested for manufacturing, but definitely for possession and sometimes distribution. Public order offenses, being drunk in public, noise violations. For juveniles, this could also be being out after curfew. And then those juvenile status offenses that are only a violation of if you're under the age of 18. So these are committed only by juveniles, and they can be adjudicated only by a juvenile court. Status offenses can include a wide variety of behaviors that we've already kind of mentioned, and can include things like being unruly, unmanageable, incorrigible if a parent feels like they can't handle their child. But things like, again, running away, truancy, underage liquor violations, smoking under the age of 18, truancy at school, all of those things. The juvenile justice system has historically treated males and females differently, by the way. For example, girls were often detained for running away and being incorrigible, while boys were kind of let off the hook for those same behaviors. Recent lawsuits have helped with this issue for girls, but it's still interesting that girls and boys are handled a little bit differently in the criminal justice system, in the juvenile justice system. The National Center for Juvenile Justice keeps track of some of the statistics involving things like running away, truants, and governability, and those underage liquor violations that we talked about, those status offenses that would be only applicable to those under the age of 18. Now, the serious delinquent, both official data and self-report surveys suggest only a small percentage of the juvenile population engage in serious delinquency. That's the good news. Those who do often escape attention. A 1981 study indicated that only 3 to 15% ever result in police contact. A second study that was done in 1987 suggested that the serious repetitive juvenile offender escaped detention 86% of the time. And remember, that's why we have that dark figure of crime with juvenile offenses. This data also suggests a small percentage of young people are committing a substantial amount of the offenses. We do have high recidivism rates for juveniles who engage in repetitive criminal behavior. More serious offenders do not specialize in one type of crime like adults tend to do. They tend to engage in a wide variety of offenses, and they tend to start getting in serious trouble early. So we're talking about the serious offender here, not somebody that's, just skipping school every once in a while. I talked about some of the gender differences in the way that court treats boys and girls historically. That is changing a little bit. Boys do outnumber girls, especially with violent offending. All types of data supports this gender gap. So if you look at any of the official statistics, we would always see that boys are outnumbering girls particularly with violent offending. Males outnumbered girls 9-1 in violent offending and violent crime in 1987, as just an example. More recent data has suggested that gender gap is actually closing, which is not a great thing. Between 1996 and 2009, arrest rates of juvenile females increased more than boys. In 2009, girls accounted for 30% of the juvenile arrests. That accounted for, by the way, 18% of arrests for violent crimes. And think about that. About 20% of the violent crimes, at least in 2009, were by juveniles. So it's definitely a serious issue. And when it comes to girls, even though they aren't arrested for violent offenses as often as boys, they are arrested for status offense violations like running away, and then sex crimes like prostitution. Most girls that are arrested do, and this accounts for adults as well as juveniles, do have a history of violence in their past. So most were actually abused in some way in their childhood. The Girls Study Group, and this was done in 2008, studied the pathways and risk factors associated with girls who offend. It concluded that when violence did occur with girls, the following was usually involved. Peer violence. Girls come to physical blows with peers for status or self-defense, typically at school. Violence at school, including anger at teachers, staff, and feelings of frustration and hopelessness, and so they are acting out at school. Violence within disadvantaged neighborhoods. Generally, this is girls having to protect themselves from violence in the neighborhoods they live in. Girls in gangs, violence for initiation protection or any other reason for violence that's required by a gang, status to get something, anger, initiation. And then, of course, we have family violence. Girls fight more with their parents than boys do, striking back at over-controlling parents, anger for some type of abuse. Remember that research suggests that both women and girls who get involved with the criminal justice system do tend to have a history of abuse. There was another study called the Pathway Study done in 2011. This was a little bit more recent study with a large sample size of 1,300 girls, had 1,300 juveniles. The problem is it had very few girls. Most research that's done in the criminal justice system is done on men, by the way. That includes both adult offenders and juvenile offenders. So most studies have few or no girls at all, giving us little information on female offenders. This one was the girls study group was particularly interesting because we didn't have a lot of research on the gender differences in girls. All right, when it comes to theories of delinquency, Terry Moffat has probably one of the most influential theories on delinquency. His delinquency theory suggests that there are two developmental pathways. One is life course persistent offenders. lifelong offenders, and they tend to start early with behavioral issues, some as young as three or four. Most have serious behavioral issues in childhood, and then they continue all through childhood and through their teenage years, and then on into adulthood with antisocial, delinquent, and criminal behaviors well into adulthood. So life courts start young with behavioral problems, and these are the ones that tend to continue into adulthood with their behaviors. Most tend to have some type of, or some can have neurological problems during childhood. We talked about what causes some of those neurological issues in a previous chapter. A small minority of children do follow a high antisocial development trajectory. So the good news, if there is any here, is that the vast majority of juveniles that get into trouble are not life course persistent offenders. They will actually age out in their early to mid 20s. Also, Moffat found with his research that 98.99% of life course persistent offenders are male. Now, the second type of delinquent that he identified in his developmental pathways theory was the adolescent limited offenders. The good news is the vast majority of juveniles follow this trajectory. They start getting into trouble during adolescence. Some can be serious, most is not, but they tend to age out of it. So by the time they're in their early to mid 20s, they stop offending, they get back on the right path, and they never have any interaction with the juvenile justice system or the adult criminal court system again. Now, there are additional pathways. A lot of people have tried to expand on Moffat's theory and suggest it doesn't have enough pathways. So additional pathways, a new stage that prolongs the crime-promoting conditions of adolescence, and that is emerging adulthood. So while Moffat said originally that these life course persistent offenders are, typically aging out of this in their early to mid 20s, the fact that we have a new developmental pathway called emerging adulthood, and all this means is, previously, if you look back, 10, well, not 10, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, the vast majority of young people, by the time that they were, 18, they were adults, they were moving out of their house, they were getting jobs, they were going to college, and some were even getting married. We are not doing that anymore. Even, 20 years ago, 22 would be a typical time for a person to graduate from college, maybe get married, start having children. It takes longer. The average bachelor's degree now takes 6 years, and more people are going to graduate school. So that means that young people are dependent on their parents for longer periods of time. They're not getting married in their early to mid 20s anymore. They're not having kids in their early to mid 20s. They're still in school. They're still dependent on their parents. It's very expensive to live, as you all know, and so a lot of people need help. And that means that we've seen an extension of this time frame. So now we do have adolescents that aren't aging out in their, by the time that they're 21 or 22, they're going into their mid 20s. So it could be that we still, once they age out in their mid to late 20s, they still age out and don't get in trouble after that. We might have a longer trajectory for that adolescent limited pathway. Gender differences, I already mentioned that Moffat said that with the life court persistent, it is more likely to be followed by males. He suggested 98.99% with males. We might see a higher incident of females now because we have more juvenile females being arrested. We don't see a lot of difference for the adolescent limited pattern in terms of gender differences. Now, with gender differences, there's an ongoing association with delinquent peers appears to be an important factor in the onset of delinquency among adolescent girls. We've already talked about in previous chapters the importance of peers and how influential peers become in life, and how one of the number one risk factors for being a delinquent is hanging out with other delinquent peers. So that tends to be something that's really important for girls in particular. Also with girls, an intimate relationship with a male delinquent is also closely connected to delinquency in adolescent girls. That goes for adult female offenders as well. A lot of them have an association with an adult male who is an offender. All right, that brings us to coercion development theory. This one was developed by Gerald Patterson in the 1980s. Like Moffat's theory, Patterson suggests early starters are at the greatest risk of more serious offending. He places emphasis. This is kind of the difference, is he places emphasis on the role of parents as the key factor. Poor parental monitoring of child's activities, disruptive family transitions like divorce, inconsistent discipline, all of those, he says, play a key factor in the early onset of delinquency. And with early onset, we tend to see life course persistent. A key predictor of early onset delinquency is a home environment where a child learns to use coercive behaviors like whining, temper tantrums, and lying, according to Gerald Patterson. It's based on the principle of social learning theory, where behavioral patterns are learned and maintained by social interactions with parents and siblings. He also has two developmental trajectories with this particular theory. Early onset, he says this is before age 4, and then adult crime. And this is very similar to Terry Moffat's theory. The earlier the onset of problematic behavior, the more likely we are to see a life course persistent offender. So the earlier we have problems, the more likely we're going to see those issues and problems with the criminal justice system continuing on into adulthood. Late onset, very similar to Moffat's theory. So this is when people start getting into trouble in late adolescence. This, he says, can begin as early as age 4, but really before age 14. This, he suggested, is age 14 or later. Kids start getting into trouble, and then as they get into their late teens, early 20s, they age out of it, and they don't get into any more trouble and don't engage in adult crime. Now, this theory attempts to also explain this theory kind of tries to attempt to explain why, talking about those problems with the home environment. He also attempts to explain gender differences. Parents tend to treat boys and girls differently. Parents tend to be more coercive towards boys than girls, resulting in more aggressive and antisocial behavior in boys. So that is kind of his theory on why we see more boys engaging in more violent delinquent behavior than girls. I mentioned in a previous chapter callous unemotional trait, and it is one of those really serious red flags that we worry about. It is having, no empathy, sympathy for other people, a limited capacity for guilt, a lack of emotional expression, lack of normal emotional expression. So the idea is that callous unemotional is a personality trait. So do some people have personality traits that make them susceptible to antisocial behavior? This theory does suggest that there are a group of traits called this callous unemotional traits, personality traits. Children diagnosed with conduct disorder who also demonstrate severe and chronic patterns of antisocial behavior, which is beyond what is normally seen with conduct disorder, like lack of empathy, sympathy, guilt, remorse, shame, all of those things that we talked about. These are big red flags. This cluster of behavior is associated with not only conduct disorder, but going on into adulthood and being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and having that psychopathic behavioral pattern. Remember, psychopathy is not a clinical diagnosis. It is a behavioral pattern that we find under the diagnostic category of antisocial personality disorder. So these are typically traits that are found in adult psychopaths. Research supports the concept of conduct disorder having this unemotional, callous unemotional set of personality traits, and it has shown that it's predictive of ongoing serious behavioral problems and a strong predictor of psychopathy in adulthood. In the DSM, remember that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they had an update, so it's on its 5th update a few years ago, and they added a specifier to the diagnosis of conduct disorder for these callous, unemotional set of personality traits. And if you're not familiar with personality theory in psychology, Personality traits are very stable over time. They do not change. It's one of the things that is most consistent about us. So if we have a set of specific personality traits, they're not going to change. They can't be treated. There's no medication for them. It is who we are biologically. All right. When it comes to treatment and rehabilitation strategies for juveniles, remember the juvenile justice system is designed to be a rehabilitative system. So it can include mental health issues, substance abuse issues. The problem is few programs are effective, and the most effective programs are really addressing all aspects of the juvenile. They're very expensive and they need to be long term. Over 2 million young people come into contact with the juvenile justice system. And of course, the goal is to rehabilitate when possible. Successful programs have very specific characteristics. They begin early, like preschool early. There's actually a link in the content for this chapter on a preschool study that showed to be very effective. When you see kids that have some of those early red flags that we talked about, getting them into preschool programs. So read that. It's really interesting. But they begin early. They follow developmental principles. They focus on multiple settings, meaning that they focus on how the child's doing in school, how are they doing with their peers. They focus on family communication. They focus on the parents. They usually have individual therapy. They have family therapy. They teach the parent parenting skills. They have tutoring for school if needed. So they focus on multiple settings: home, school, social. They acknowledge the differences in cultural backgrounds, and they definitely focus on the family first, with especially with parenting issues and communication within the family. Now, the classification of prevention and intervention programs, we have primary prevention. This is also known as universal prevention, designed to prevent delinquent behavior before any behavioral problems begin. Usually large groups in preschool or school programs. The High Hopes preschool is an example of a primary prevention program. And again, there is a link to that in D2L. It includes education programs for kids, as well as family educations, nutrition, prenatal, parenting skills, teaching parenting skills. Primary prevention, the development and includes the development and enhancement of resiliency. Resiliency is a protective factor against many of the early risk factors that we talked about. Resiliency is an interesting topic in psychology. It's an ordinary, not an extraordinary process, and it can be taught to at-risk kids. Teaching creativity, self-efficacy, peer relations, attachment to healthy institutions. Remember, we talked about if kids are, attached to parents, school, if they have some kind of hobby that they love, whether it's music or sports, all of those things can help with kids, and that is part of resiliency. Resiliency, it's so interesting because there's a lot of research on why are some kids more resilient than others. Why do some kids who are abused grow up and have no problems, and other kids who are abused grow up and have all kinds of problems? And one of the theories is some people are just biologically more resilient than others. And so now they're studying whether or not there is a resiliency gene. So the idea that we can teach resiliency, that has shown to be effective, but it could also be that some people are just more biologically resilient. Selective prevention, also called secondary prevention. This is working with specific children or adolescents who are at risk or at high risk, who are already showing signs of antisocial behavior. The goal is to try to prevent young people from going on to more serious and habitual behaviors. Again, the earlier the better with selective programs. These programs target more than one risk factor, and the ones that target more than one risk factor are the most successful, including disruptive behaviors, family issues, aggression, family issues. Again, the Fast Track experiment is an example of a selective prevention program, also a primary prevention program, reaching large number of groups both at-risk kids and kids who have already been had contact with the criminal justice system. It's based on um, developmental theories, which suggest multiple influences interact in the development of antisocial behaviors. We've already kind of addressed that. All of the things that happen in early childhood tend to be multi-phase programs that involve curriculum in the classroom, family meetings, home visits, tutoring, after-school programs, address cognitive issues, academic skills, family dynamics, positive peer interactions, and have been shown to be fairly effective. The problem is, when we're talking about school programs, after school programs, at home visits, family therapy, individual therapy, tutoring, it's very expensive and they need to be long term. We can't just go in for 3 months. We need a long term. So that is, 6 months to a year or longer. And then we have territory prevention programs, and these are treatment programs. So these are programs designed to reduce serious habitual delinquent or antisocial behaviors that have already been adjudicated by the court. So these are kids that have problems with behavioral problems, drug and alcohol issues, and they are put into some type of treatment program. And there are a lot of different types of treatment programs out there for juveniles. Treatment approaches will teach self-regulation skills, address faulty thinking patterns, teach problem solving. Again, will include family, schools, peers, community. These are really the most effective ones are really addressing all aspects of the juvenile. Now, the different types of treatment approaches, we have traditional residential treatment programs. So these are typically some type of institutional setting where the juvenile is sent away to some type of facility. This is usually for substance abuse issue, emotional disturbance, low academic achievement. Studies show studies do not show good results. Some even show higher incarceration rates for young people in residential programs versus treating somebody while they're at home. Sending juveniles away from the home setting, even if the home setting is not terribly healthy, is really disruptive for young people. But sometimes that is necessary, especially if there are some serious problems going on in the home. Multisystemic therapy called MST. This is for serious juvenile offenders, addresses known causes of juvenile delinquency at the individual level. So that's family level, peers, school level, and even the community. Focuses on the family. Counselor and family collaborate to develop goals and create plans to meet those goals. There's daily contact, about 60 hours over 4 months. So this is a very intensive program. Studies suggest that it is effective in reducing delinquency because it is so intensive and it lasts for a longer period of time. So typically, this is at a minimum 4 months. A South Carolina study found arrest and incarceration rates reduced by 64% in a 59-week follow-up study of multisystemic therapy. A 1995 study followed 176 participants for 14 years. That's called a longitudinal study, by the way, and found significantly lower recidivism rates when compared to a control group that did not attend multi-systemic therapy. So it was 50% for 50% recidivism rates, which is still pretty high for the multi-systemic therapy participants, but 81% by the juveniles that did not engage in the multi-systemic program. The two key changes that seems to really make a difference is when it comes to the family dynamics is caregiver discipline and peer relations associated with good social peers who have good social skills. So these tend to be the biggest things that make a difference. Focusing on the family teaching parenting skills, and then getting young people to hang out with more pro-social peers. Those tend to be the two issues that seem to make the biggest difference long-term for effectiveness with programs. Functional family therapy is similar to the multisystemic therapy, has intensive treatment services within the family setting. So it's really just focusing on the family and not as much on school and peers. All right, so there's some great resources under this chapter in D2L, including crime statistics, a couple of interesting articles to read. If you have any questions about anything in this chapter, let me know. Otherwise, have a great